stewardship ecologist for McHenry County Conservation District, and also Ren, as well as our other stewardship ecologists. And we are here to introduce Tom. So take it away, Tom.
Hello. We're going to talk about seed dispersal, plant population movement today. This is a topic that I almost backed into as an ecologist. I would say kind of back in the 80s in graduate school, studying landscapes and studying how they changed over time and trying to understand that site history and the disturbance history and how the vegetation changed with disturbance. And and then have realized over the years that's all about the movement of populations, the movement of populations of plants. I'm going to come back to that theme a number of times. But before I get into the nuts and bolts of the presentation, my two able assistants, Ren and Jackie, claim, which kind of ridiculously, that they can summarize this entire talk in a few minutes. I don't know what to say. I highly doubt that, but I thought I'd humor them and give them a chance. And the title of their little presentation is called Darwin's Seed. So take it away, guys.
Nothing could be more planted than a plant.
We all know they can't move with the season, and we all know the reason.
It's the miles and miles of tiny tangled roots and rocks,
fine filaments finagling, winding, binding every clump of soil past billions of microbes,
slyly hiding in every tiny crack.
That's a fact, and it makes the smallest movement lack in possibility.
No leg, no foot, just a tapping root with no mobility.
No ability to miss the hungry jaws or sawyer's saws.
Or creep to a watery spring, seep drinking deep on a dry, desiccating day.
Plants are stuck.
And I have a nagging notion that the earth is still in motion.
So a static population dies when fiery conflagrations or hungry hordes of herbivores devour the vegetation?
When glaciers bury continents or climates change from cold to torrid,
when oceans flood the land and then pull back,
or horrid asteroids impact.
Oh, how do plants escape their stationary fate?
We've reached a contradiction.
Plants can't move, but staying put leads to extinction.
Perhaps we're asking plants to do that which they can't.
And it's not within one generation, but betwixt that their migration is achieved.
Wait, I think you've got it.
Restless seeds escape from mama's stationary state with flying wings, or edible enticements sweet,
to feed the ant who slowly creeps away,
or tempts the bird to eat and then excrete,
or jay to cache a nut before retreat,
or lacking edibility by a prickly burr's tick-like ability to ride by tiny, hairy hooks on passing pelage.
Yes, Miss Plant Dispersal is no rehearsal.
It's the big show, the main event.
Fate's barely open door only momentarily awaits.
So scatter those seeds, precious to every crack and crevice.
Every dry, dusty crust of droughty hill and every puddle of muddy fill.
The goal is scant survival in a world with no revival from extinction.
So, in a circus of circumstance, a legion of tiny chances is the best I can suggest.
And on a million silent, slimy, clingy, creepy, crawly,
poopy, flying, long odds, 1 in a million bets,
no less.
The shifting, squirming, turning, dying, birthing,
ever-changing, glorious, leafy, great green earth depends. The end.
Thank you, guys. I must admit that kind of says it all. Maybe I should just stop now. That'd be a nice, quick, compact presentation. People get on in the morning with what do they have to do, but maybe I should fill in a few of the gaps here. Our little presentation there pointed to both of these problems I want to bring up to start with, to just stop and think about this, the fundamental problem of a plant. So many things in life, we meet our needs by moving from one place to another, but a plant can't do that. And it can't do that because it's linked, its way of making a living is so fundamentally different. It stays in one place and it creates a root system that has a vast surface area of contact with the earth. And it creates an above ground structure with with multiplicity of thousands to millions of leaves, all of which have a maximum contact surface area with the atmosphere. And then when you have a moist earth and sun shining up above and the humidity drops below 100%, water moves from the soil through the tree, out of the leaves and out into the air. It's a solar powered pump that feeds the plant both with water and nutrients, and the plant expends absolutely no energy to accomplish that. So it's some ways it's a marvelously efficient way of making a living, with the exception that the plant has made this commitment. It can't move, so it's stuck in one place. And there's another problem with plants, and I want to pose a little problem for you, and you can put your answers in the chat. Think about a dandelion. We've all had experience with dandelions. Generally, not one of those things we like in our yard. But so we're going to say a dandelion has 5 seed heads every year, and each seed head has 150 seeds. Now, in this example, just to make the math simple, I'm going to assume a dandelion only lives 1 year. In fact, it lives a number of years, and often any one plant can have more than 5 seed heads. But just to keep the math simple, we'll say it that way. So each seed then germinates and grows into another plant the next year, and each plant then grows and produces 5 seed heads. So we have one plant with 5 seed heads. The next, it produces 150 seeds per head. So that would be 750 seeds every year. So if every plant covers 3.5 inches on a square, 3.5 inches on the side, or 12.5 square inches of ground surface, how much ground do the descendants of the first dandelion cover in 10 years? And so you have, well, there's 4 choices here. All of Glacial Park, that's 3,500 acres, just covered completely. All of Illinois, which is 37 million acres. All of the United States, that's 2.3 billion acres, or the entire land surface of the earth, that's 37 billion acres, or none of the above. So what is your answer? One dandelion, 5 seed heads a year, 150 seeds for every seed head.
Making us work hard in the morning, Tom.
Yeah.
I saw a few people thinking about typing in the chat. Feel free to just pick one and go for it.
Yeah, just a letter, yeah.
I see an E.
An E,
A
none of the
B.
above. A B, all of Illinois. That's a lot of space.
Other takers out there?
Okay, well, it's actually would cover the entire land surface of the earth, 10,000 plants deep. This is Darwin actually, it's the power of exponential growth that kind of works differently than our brains work. So in Darwin's example, he was talking about what if elephants, which are remarkably slow breeding creatures, but if all the offspring of the elephants survive, the entire surface of the earth would be covered by elephants in 100 years. Well, with dandelions, if we assume dandelions are annual, they're actually perennial, but if they were annual, to maintain a stable population, the mortality rate of dandelions seeds would have to be 749 out of 750. Every dandelion would only have 1 successful seed. So that's 99.9% mortality, and that's to maintain a stable population. Not a shrinking population, but a stable population. So plants, by being sedentary, they can't move. All they can do is scatter seeds out more or less randomly, not completely randomly, but more or less randomly, and just hope that at least one of them out of hundreds and hundreds of thousands, one of them can manage to germinate and produce another plant. So that's a pretty fearsome obstacle to reproduction and maintaining a population over time. That's the million, silent, slimy, clean, creepy, crawly, poopy, flying, long odds, 1 in a million bets. So it really is that one dandelion seed out of all those seeds that can survive. Dispersal is the key to long-term survival of the species, because wherever you are today will one day be unsuitable. And we'll go through a number of different dimensions of that statement, but it's true. Plants have to move. Eventually, not the plant has to move, but the population of plants needs to move to survive. For instance, in glaciation, look at this as the last 500,000 years in the northern, we're in North America, in particular the northern part of North America, and you see each one of those downward trends in that blue line is a glacial period. So 4 different glacial periods in which basically any plant would have had to migrate southward hundreds of miles and then come back northward again. So the only plants we have living in Illinois today are ones that could make that journey, not once, but at least 4 times. And plants that couldn't do that just went extinct. They were left behind somewhere during the Pleistocene. Yes, indeed. How do plants escape such an imprisoned stationary fate? They have to be able to move, and yet their very structure as a plant and the way they make a living seem to prevent that movement. So what we want to do is to shift from thinking about the plant so much as thinking about the population of plants and how populations move over time. Yeah, plants are more amoeba. At a population level, they sort of start to resemble more of an amoeba in the way they spread and move over a surface. The individual plant is stationary, but the population is constantly moving. So when we think of a pretty familiar phenomena like a grassy field that starts to fill in with shrubbery, and then small trees, and then larger trees. I mean, we can think of this as that grassy field becoming a shrubby field, becoming a forest, but that's not actually what is happening. What's happening is the outside is moving to the inside. All of the plants that are in that lower right-hand picture of a forest, all of them are present in the upper left, only you couldn't see them because they were on the outside of that grassy field. And the whole transformation is one of migration and occupation of this area. It's not the area in and of itself changing into anything. It can't change into anything else. It is what it is. That area of the surface changes by virtue of the migration and movement of plant populations into that area. Venice is just a fancy 25-cent word coming from the outside. So it's really seed and plant populations moving in from outside sources that's changing that that area. But let's step back from that movement in space for a minute and think about this other kind of movement in time. And it's a movement that we first don't think of as dispersal and movement, but in fact it is, because plants have to move. An annual plant in Illinois has to move through the winter. It has to move over the winter to the time when it can grow the next year. So it creates a seed that somehow gets through that period of time when germination and growth are simply not possible. How does it move across that inhospitable period of time? And that's done through seed dormancy. If we take native annuals like jewelweed, or on the right-hand side, the tall bellflower, a beautiful savanna plant. These are both annuals that grow in our ecosystems here in the upper Midwest in McHenry County. And one of my favorite little plants, false mermaid, I love it because it's such a tiny, tiny little plant that could go unnoticed, and it has such a wonderful long name, Floerkia proserpinicoides. And all of these plants have to make it through the winter as seed. They can't make it through as a living plant. They have to make it through simply as seed. Likewise with our native spiny barnyard grass, that you find growing in ephemeral ponds late in the summer when the water dries up. Barnyard grass, the seeds germinate, they grow very rapidly, produce seed, it falls on the surface during the winter that fills up, ices over. The next spring it melts, and you just have a pool of water for several months. But then as late summer comes and it starts to dry down, as the mud is exposed, the barnyard grass seeds germinate, grow into a mature plant, produce seed, and drop the seed again. So that dispersal that gets them through the flooding period in the winter allows the same plant to grow one grow each year. So it's the dispersal through time that allows that. One of our most troublesome non-native weeds, sweet clover, particularly in prairie restorations, is such. This one has very long-term dispersal. So once sweet clover seed gets into the area, I mean, sweet clover has been planted by farmers and then by other people for erosion control probably since the late 19th century. And you'll go for several years and you won't really see much of it, maybe one here and there around the edges of a field or along a roadside. And then if we burn a prairie, suddenly it will come up in just a cloud of white sweet clover. How did it get there? Well, it didn't all disperse into that area after the fire. What happened was the seed was already there. The seed has been there. It can last for decades in the soil. So some of this seed may have been put down before things even became prairies, or maybe it moves slowly in through bird dispersal and gets into these areas and waits to germinate after the fire. It stimulates germination, and so you have millions of plants that grow all at once. They produce seed and then die down. And the next year you look at the same place and you won't see any sweet clover again, or very few. So that dispersal through time is a really key way that plants move, populations move. They have to move in time as well as in space. But most of the presentation today, we're going to talk about that movement in space, which is a bit more familiar. That's what we think about when we think about seed dispersal. And we've probably all, from time to time, thought about it. Some of it's pretty obvious. Birds eat berries and poop them out somewhere, and you get dandelions, honeysuckle growing in your woods. We're kind of familiar with that, and we know that dandelions disperse their seeds on the wind. But let's look at this in just a bit more detail. And we'll start off with wind dispersed seeds. I don't know of a single ecologist who actually uses these fancy words, but whenever you start looking it up, they use them. Anemochory is for wind dispersed seeds, and anemo, like anemometer, is for measuring the wind. So anem is wind, and chory is movement. One of the means of long-term dispersal, what we don't think about, because the very things that are dispersing are so small we virtually can't see them, is the wind dispersal of just tiny spores. Scouring rush has spores that actually have these little arms sticking out called elaters, and that helps them float on the wind. And so you have about 15 species of scouring rushers, and they're worldwide in distribution. The same species, I think, other than Antarctica, they're on all the continents of the Earth, and they're there because they can get into the upper atmosphere and just move around the Earth. So those same species occur over and over again on various places all over the Earth's surface because of that super long range means of dispersal. It's similar with our ferns, which the means of dispersal is a spore. These spores don't have the elater, but they're still sort of silt-sized particles, but lighter than silt, and so they can get into the atmosphere and move even across oceans. And starting to go, my wife is British, and started to visit England in the early 1990s, and was sort of surprised and gratified that I actually knew some of the plants, because the flowering plants, for the most part, weren't the same, which was a challenge. I enjoy a challenge, but I noticed that the ferns were the same species I was familiar with from the Midwest, at least most of them. And like Polypodium vulgare, I found that growing on rocks in England, and that's because the spores can actually move across the ocean. So we have that much greater means of dispersal. Now, when we talk about seed plants, seeds tend to be larger and don't move that far. And so with the evolution of flowering plants, and that's about 100 million years ago, suddenly the populations of plants on different continents were cut off from one another, and we developed these distinctive local floras. And we'll come back to that idea of a local flora later on in the presentation today. So when we look at seeds, let's think about just the size of them with something like a silver maple seed. Sizes are fairly large as we move down to green ash, or those are white ash seeds. Something like a milkweed seed is quite a bit smaller, and we get down to cottonwood seeds are just tiny little specks with a little puff of air attached to them. And then you get down to dust-like seeds like orchids that are really down to that sill-sized particle, can just basically float on the wind for very long distances. So we have both the size of seeds and we have the way in which they use the wind for transport. So let's think about the big ones like silver maple seeds. I did some quick calculations and looked online, and sailplanes or gliders have a mass to wing area ratio of about 0.02 to 0.04 grams per centimeter squared. And the silver maple seed, it turns out, is just about the same. So like silver maples have invented basically the same thing. It's a wing uh, and about the same mass to surface area ratio as the gliders we invented sometime in the 20th century. Likewise, gyrocopters. When I was a kid, I would steal my younger brother's comic books, and in the back they were advertising gyrocopters, and I didn't quite understand how those things work. But a gyrocopter, you see, has a motor that just pushes it forward. What looks like a helicopter up here, the what looks like a propeller on top isn't in fact under power. What the gyrocopter works by pushing itself through the air, and the wing on the propeller on top spins just as a silver maple seed spins as it falls. In this case, it's gravity that's providing the motive force. Here you have an engine pushing the gyrocopter forward, but in both cases, you have a spinning airfoil that generates lift, and that's what allows the silver maple seed to fall very slowly. All works on the same principle of an airfoil, the air passing more slowly over the underside of the airfoil than the upper side, and so generating higher pressure on the lower side and lift. It turns out that life discovered long before Bernoulli came up with his law, life discovered the airfoil long before that. So the wing seed on conifers goes back to about 270 million years before present. Pterosaurs, that's one of our favorite, actually, they weren't dinosaurs, they were flying lizards. But they always appear in every comic book or cartoon of the dinosaur period. They're about 220 million years ago. Insects push it even farther back to 325 to 400 million years ago. They're able to generate sufficient lift to start flying. But land plants and wind dispersed spores go even farther back than that, to about 450 million years ago. And so that ability of life to fly goes back 450 million years in the Earth's history. People, on the other hand, had to wait until the 20th century. Not belittling the Wright brothers, great achievement, but they were 450 million years late on that discovery. Parachutes, on the other hand, as opposed to airfoils, are really just using air resistance, displacing a lot of air with the tiny fibers. As it starts to fall, it falls very, very slowly. It has a great air resistance and a very small mass, and so it falls slowly. Same principle as a parachute works. So that was wind dispersed seed. Let's look at hitchhiker seeds. That's epi This is the by Burs, prickly Burs, tick-like ability to ride by tiny hook, hairy hooks on passing pelage. So pelage is fur or feathers that covers an animal, generally for insulation and for other purposes. But the epi here, the zo is animal and core is movement again, and this means outside. So these are seeds that stay on the outside of animals and get movement. And this is a familiar one to anyone who's kind of walked around in farm country where you get a lot of cockleburs, particularly where you've got wet spots along the edges of fields. Cockleburs like that wetness. And it's fascinating to me. I did a presentation on plant families just a few weeks ago. How you end up with a structure which is a long hair-like structure with a hook on the end. Where does that come from? In this case, uh, these are the bracts. This is a composite flower in the aster family, and it's these what are called involucral bracts or filaries that create the involucral bracts that then turn into these long hooks that grab onto the hair of animals. And with burdock, which is another one of those tick-like plants, it looks very different, but it's also the involucre that the bracts become specialized into these structures with a long, tiny little hooks that grab onto your clothing as you walk past. Whereas with something like Bidens or beggar ticks, these are I don't know, it's probably a dozen common species in the Chicago area, and they grow generally in wetlands, most of them anyway. And in this case, this is in the aster family also. This is the ovary of the aster. And if this were still in the flower, you would see the flower tube coming out this end, and sepals or excuse me, petal, stamen, and pistil there. But outside of that are these hairs. And if you remember if you tuned into any of my plant related Tom Talks, all flowers have the same structure. And they starting from the outside is sepal, petal, stamen, pistil. So whatever is outside of the sepal or outside of the petal is the stamen. And so these hairs are actually modified stamens, as are the prongs over here of the Biden's seed are modified stamens. They don't look anything like stamens, but instead of modifying involucral bracts of the flower head, here the stamens are modified into these little prongs that grab onto your clothing as you walk past. In the case of Hekelia, one of the most tenacious Burs in our area, that tend to grow in oak savannas. And once they get into a wool coat, it's hard to get them out again. Here it's outgrowths of the ovary wall that create the tiny hooks. It almost looks like little anchors on the end that are grabbing onto your clothing. Over here you have wild carrot, which is a bit less of a tenacious burr, but a burr nonetheless that grabs onto your clothing as you go past, or an animal's fur, and in that way you act as a dispersal agent. Desmodium would seem to be a friendly little tick-like plant, because here you have a legume pod. It divides into segments like this, and it's just covered with fine hairs. And the hairs are sort of bent over at the end. A hair in a plant isn't like your hair or my hair, which starts deep in the skin as this completely separate structure and grows out through the epidermis. Rather, the hair of plants is just an outgrowth of an epidermal cell, and in this case, it just curls at the end to create that structure that can grab onto. So, and when you get them on, if you get a few of them on your clothes, it's easy to just pick them off and brush them off. It's no problem. But if you've ever been on one of our seed collection days at Goose Lake that has a lot of Desmodium growing in the field, you end up covered head to toe with the stuff. And at that point, it's rather difficult to get them all off. It takes an hour going through your clothing just to scrape all of them off. But just another way that plants move their seeds from one place to another. I like people always say that burrs are nature's Velcro, and we've got it backwards here. The cocklebur is not nature's Velcro. Velcro is a crude industrial imitation of the burr-like plant. Let's give credit where credit is due. I mean, that looks kind of crude and mechanically uniform, but when you look at the actual surface of a cocklebur, each different hook is slightly different length and curling nature. All right, let's go through one that probably you don't think of as often uh, with plant dispersal, and that's dispersal by water. The obvious ones are like coconuts. We don't have any of those around here, but that big, occasionally you'll see for sale in the grocery store where they still have the big hairy husk on them. That's for flotation, and the plant can even germinate while it's in the seawater and then start growing when it's washed up on a beach. So you can get dispersal from one island or one shoreline to another. Likewise, with mangroves in the tropics, you have plants that can disperse. The seeds actually germinate when they're still connected to the plant, and then they just float around with that root already exposed, waiting to lodge in the mud and start growing again. In our area, we actually do have some plants that seem to be specialized to do that. Water plantain and American lotus. In the case of water plantain, it's the fruit, the achene is flotation. In the case of American lotus, the receptacle of the flower, the structure under the petals there, actually expands and becomes the structure that then floats in the water and the seeds fall out one at a time. And bladdernut is a fascinating, beautiful native shrub that grows often in the vicinity of streams, and it creates this little bladder, completely sealed, airtight bladder, and the seeds are like little pieces of popcorn on the inside. So it has the potential to move in the water downstream and then lodge along the side of the stream um, um, during flooding times. But I think those are all very specialized cases, but I think we really need to expand water dispersal to cover a lot of plants that are growing in riparian areas along streams, because during flood stage, all the seeds that are lying on the ground or on plants are picked up by moving water and moved and redeposited again. I mean, one of the difficulties of trying to do any sort of plant restoration, community restoration along rivers and streams is the amount of canary grass, which is an invasive grass from Eurasia that whose seeds then move in the water and are deposited along the riparian soil and are growing up. So any plant that lives in these areas, or most plants that live in these areas, are at least occasionally dispersed by the water. This is probably one of the more fun means of dispersal, and that's the explosive dispersal. Who doesn't like to play with impatiens seeds? The little capsule starts off sort of narrow, and then it gets fatter and fatter and fatter. And when just before it bursts on its own, if you touch it, just very lightly squeeze it, it just pops between your fingers. I still can't help myself every time I'm around impatiens at that time late in the summer when the seeds are mature, the fruits are mature. I just love to pop a few between my fingers. And the seeds can fly several feet when you do that, which sort of makes you wonder, is that really enough? I mean, that doesn't seem like much of a distance of dispersal. And I suspect it's only one means of dispersal, and anything that walks through those muds is picking up the seeds on its feet and moving them. So I think it's probably wrong to think that any one seed is always dependent on simply one means of dispersal. Rather, they can be secondarily dispersed by other means, by just animals walking by and eating things and moving them, or getting caught on their fur, or getting stuck on your boots and carrying them around. This is a fun one. This is witch hazel, which is a native shrub. I don't know if it's native in McHenry County. It's native very nearby. It's not in the county. But when I took my first dendrology class, it would have been in the late 80s. We had to do a project of collecting tree fruits, and I collected these and put them in my kitchen to dry in my little apartment. And I was watching television on my little 12-inch black and white television, and I heard these things. I heard this popping sound and these things flying around in the kitchen. I didn't know what was going on. And I didn't find out until the next morning. I went in to cook breakfast, and I saw that the witch hazel fruits had popped open, and I looked around and I found those little black seeds on the floor. They were actually ricocheting off the walls in the kitchen. So these things can actually fly 30 or 40 feet. Um, which leads to a question. If seeds were projected 30 feet every year, how far could the population have migrated in 10,000 years of a warmer climate? And the answer to that is 57 miles. That's not very far. So it could be that these seeds need a secondary means of dispersal, that those little seeds have to either be eaten or picked up on animals' feet and moved. So sometimes when you do the math, you realize that this means of dispersal probably isn't enough. It's certainly effective in the short range, but probably enough to move long ranges. Now let's look at one that's familiar to all of us, of particularly birds, but other animals eating fruits and moving them. I remember listening to someone say that these Osage orange fruits, farmers call them hedge apples because they planted Osage orange in hedgerows back in the 1930s, and are still left in a few places in farm country. And those big, massive fruits are then eaten by cattle and then moved around as the cattle poop the seeds out. You'll find old pastures often with hedge apple trees or Osage orange trees growing there. Likewise with some things like honey locust. They call it honey locust because there's a lot of sugar in the pod when it's green, and animals like to eat it, and they can move those seeds in their digestive tract and poop them out later. Deer love to eat honey locust seed pods. The tiny little seeds of white clover that grows in your yard can pass through a bird's digestive tract and be pooped out the other end, effective means of long-range dispersal. And we have other ways that animals move seeds also. And this is one that I've spent a lot of time with recently because I've been doing work on oak reproduction for about 15 years now. And it turns out that acorns get around by gathering and caching, but they're not the only ones. Even some large, like sunflower plants with large seeds, often at least primarily or secondarily rely on animals moving those seeds and storing them for winter food consumption and occasionally forgetting about them, and that then serves as a means of dispersal. So we have, well, here's one really cool one. Sedges. Many sedges rely on ants as a means of dispersal, and they do that by creating these little fleshy structures around the seed, and the seeds are then picked up by ants who are eating the eliasone, but they're storing them first, and so the ants are moving these seeds around, um, and which leads to another question. How could pen sedge? I think this is when we ask people. So these are some of the answers we got about sticking your thumb out and hitchhiking, which is a great answer, only I don't think sedge perigynia have thumbs, so we have to strike that one. The vision board idea, perhaps, but that sort of breaks one of the rules of detective fiction. You can't have supernatural causes. So, and then the birds in Gone with the Wind. I like both of those movies. They were great, but I don't think they can explain sedge dispersal. But at 3 inches per second for one, if the ants moved at 3 inches, could carry a sedge seed at 3 inches per second for 1 month each year. So during the period of dispersal, ants could walk around the earth 49 times in 11,000 years. So turns out that while the seeds projecting 30 feet from a witch hazel fruit aren't the same as ants moving at 3 inches per second, where they can move around the earth 49 times. So this is I love to math can be fun if you just try to project some of these funny little measurements in time. Here is one that strikes much closer to my work, and that's squirrels and acorns. I have um, been thinking about squirrels and acorns now for more than a decade, sometimes almost chasing them around in my front yard when they've got an acorn in their mouth, trying to figure out what they're doing with it. But all the rodents in our area, in particular southern flying squirrels, which, like gray squirrels and fox squirrels, move an acorn and then bury it in the surface soil, are key means of acorn dispersal for oaks, as are, well, chipmunks and some other rodents like ground squirrels and voles and deer mouse mice can move acorns. They don't tend to bury them in the surface soil and are not often effective means of dispersal. Blue jays, on the other hand, they can move and they just push the acorn into the soil and then generally kick some leaves or plant debris on top of it. That is an effective means of dispersal. And I've seen places where it was obvious that blue jays were the means of dispersal for acorns to move out into a former farm field. But if you go west, you find acorn woodpeckers that can move plants for very long, or move acorns for a long distance. They tend to cache them in trees, as do our native red-bellied woodpeckers. So they disperse the acorn, but they're not putting it into a place where it can be effective for growing another tree. I just added this one because it's always fascinated me that tiny seeds could hold on to you just by electrostatic charges, just like an animal moving through brushing against plants tends to lose electrons in the vegetation, hence accumulate a positive electrical charge. Ticks jump to their host using those electromagnetic or electrostatic forces. So when you're picking up ticks, they're actually jumping from the plant to you as you walk through there, and it's using the electrostatic charge to do that. And bees, likewise, I think I got some images here. So those tiny ticks actually use electrostatic forces, as does pollen jumping to a bee. It seems to me that tiny seeds could actually do the same thing. I can't find any support for that, so I'm just throwing it out there as a possibility. If any of you are young students, you could maybe do that for your master's thesis. Here is a means of dispersal by the movement of continents. This whole idea of moving continents really came from Alfred Wegener in the very early, he was born in 1880, very early 20th century. Unfortunately, with Alfred, he couldn't think of a means of continents moving, and so his ideas were thrown away by the later 20th century and weren't revived again until the 1960s, when they discovered through plate tectonics that continents actually can move. So just nodding our heads to Alfred, who really came up with this idea long before anyone else. One of the questions I asked you was about the movement of American beech, and we came up with a number of different answers to it. And I'm going to go through these using my puzzle rules. And the puzzle rules come from rules of detective fiction, but we're basically doing the same thing. We're trying to solve a mystery: no supernatural forces, no undiscovered causes, no unaccountable intuitions, and you can't claim to have done it yourself, and there's no twins involved. So with no twins, we have two answers. It wasn't me, it was my evil twin in an alternative planet. So we have to cross those off. Those break the rules. A lot of boaty sort of answers of floating, and I have to take those out of. That's sort of like secret rooms. We have plants using boats and things. GPS solar flares. Again, that's kind of an undiscovered hidden cause there. The Birds, love the movie. Great movie. Everyone should see that movie, but again, probably not very effective in this case. I have to give special mention to the beach, the play on words, because when I was a graduate student in the late 1980s, we were giving presentations in a seminar, and one guy was giving a presentation, and his title of his presentation was The American Beachfront. And when he told me that, for weeks I thought he was going to give a presentation on the ecology of sand dunes. And it turned out he was doing it on beach and the migration of beach across the Midwest in the late Holocene as it was coming northward from glaciation. So that one, that one meant something to me. But continents were once connected. That's pretty close to the answer there. The continents weren't actually connected at the time, but they were close. They were close by. So it turns out that in the tertiary was a much, much warmer climate than today, and these areas that are presently covered in ice were suitable for plants, temperate plants. And so things like hornbeams, the European and American hornbeam are very similar, or the European and American beech. Those were those seem to make this hot when they were close together in the late Holocene, and those temperate forests were up there in very high northern latitudes. But even today, pollen can make it across the Atlantic Ocean. And so there are genes that can move across the Atlantic Ocean. Probably very, very rarely would that actually fertilize a flower on the other side. But it's at least possible that there's some gene flow across the Atlantic Ocean even today. With glaciers, we have this puzzle of extreme climate fluctuations, but according to the fossil record, very low extinction rates. So how did that happen? Yeah, how did plants make it across, or how did they move so quickly? And unfortunately, we can't admit the running trees. They didn't do that. So how did they do that? How did they get? Well, one of the ways they could have done it, this is one of the answers, was hiding. And that at first people discounted that idea, but more recently it's been brought up by some ecologists that perhaps there were actually refugia further north than we thought, that some of these plant species could have survived not under the ice, but at least in not far from the ice. And so they really didn't have as far to move after glacial time ended. But for most of these plants, we're assuming that they moved south and moved back north again after the glacial period. And some of the early work on this was done by a woman named Margaret Davis. I actually had the honor of meeting her on a field trip in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan when I was doing my graduate work. And she created these beautiful graphs of like white pine at 10,000 years was this far north, at 8,000 years this far north, and at 5,000 years this far north. So it was actually white pine was only arriving in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where I was working about 8,000 years ago. And beech actually has only arrived in the eastern part of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan even today and hasn't migrated as far as the western part. So that migration is still going on. And one of the things I wanted to point out with plant migration is that during warming climate, the expansion northward is because it's being relieved from cold temperature extremes, but the contraction southward is very different. It's because other plants are moving northward and providing competition and forcing those original inhabitants out. And so the population seems to be moving northward, but very different things. It's the relief of cold climate extremes on the north and competition on the south. So that um, when we think about answers to climate change today, we have to be aware that all exotic species move or have moved by assisted migration. It's people that have moved them around, which is just an unintentional form of assisted migration. And in the long term, and under the most extreme conditions, assisted migration may allow us to keep plants alive that couldn't be alive otherwise if climates change at some of the upper estimates of what they could change in the next 60, 70, 80 years. But under less extreme conditions, we may be moving plants into this area that are simply providing more plants for the native plants of the area. So this whole issue of assisted migration is to me still controversial, how we should respond to this. Which raises the question of exactly what is a native species, because many species didn't all just move up here immediately when the ice left. They've arrived at a variety of times since since the end of the cold climate period of the Pleistocene, and so some of them have been here for a long time, and some of them really haven't been here very long at all. Post-glacial migration is really still ongoing, or it could be ongoing with many of our native plant species of the eastern United States. It's simply been interrupted by European American settlement of the area. So there's no real evidence that the vegetation of Chicago region was absolutely stable during the last 10,000 years, only that it was much, much more stable than it is today. And instead, it was really an open system and receiving migration from north, south, east, and west, really mostly from the south, but most south, east, and west plant movements, especially since North America had a lot of people here and they were moving around from place to place. And so obviously this plant dispersal was happening regularly over this very long period of time. So the question, I think it's a question, why do native species matter? And I throw this in because when you start talking about plant dispersal and plant movements, I seem to be making the case that nothing belongs anywhere, but that's not really the case. I think, first of all, in answer to that question about why native species matter, I think first thing you have to do is accept a moral premise. And maybe in another presentation, we can go through the background of that moral premise. But I think conserving the diversity of life at a genetic, species, and ecosystem level matters. I think all of us that are listening to this presentation today or our familiarity with natural areas believe that. We believe it matters. And the global diversity of life is and always was regionally structured, particularly since the evolution of flowering plants. We have distinctive flora in Eurasia and in different parts of Eurasia, in North America and South America and Australia and Africa. All of these places have very distinctive local floras, and then we mix them together, it leads to extinction. I mean, we've known that since Darwin. If you actually read Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, he talks about mixing floras together and causing extinction. And we know that plant communities today are changing tens to hundreds of times faster than prior to European American settlement. And that the diversity of native species is diminishing every year. I mean, these are all commonly accepted realities. And so protecting and restoring what we have or only recently lost is the safest path for conservation. To me, this is the argument for ecological restoration today and for the importance of native species and native ecosystems. So this is kind of the background to me of plant movements and the history of life on the earth. And on a million silent slimy, even I can't say it. Silent slimy, creepy crawly, poofy flying, long odds, 1 in a million bets, no less. The shifting, squirming, turning, birthing, dying, birthing, ever changing, glorious, leafy, great green earth depends. Thank you. So, any questions?
Remember, you have the option of either unmuting yourself and asking your question, or if you want to put it in the chat, you can type. I know I told Tom I would write down a couple of my questions from when I got the preview earlier, just to help fill the time while people are thinking.
Okay.
But are mechanisms of dispersal quicker to change than the actual reproductive structures of plants?
Yeah,
Or
I
like,
think I
why
made
would that be?
yeah, I think I made that case in the talk on plant families that the structure of a flower has been it's very conservative. There was an original flowers somewhere around 100 million years ago, and it was organized by sepal, petal, stamen, pistil in the middle. And every single flower since then, hundreds of thousands of species of flowers over millions of years, all of them have had that same conserved structure. Um, and yet we see with these dispersal structures a lot of crazy differences in fruits and means that seeds can get around. And it turns out that the flower the flower changes very slowly in evolutionary time because no flower can change on its own, or it can't change other than by very tiny increments, because the flower is a structure that is built to exchange pollen with another flower of the same kind. And so if it changes very much, it can no longer, the pollinating organism no longer visits both flowers, it visits flowers that only look like each other. So the flower is a conserved structure and changes in very conservative fashion over long periods of time because it has to coordinate its changes with all the other flowers in a population. Whereas you could have a population of sort of, let's say, the proto-cocklebur that's first developing this burr-like flower. One member of the species develops a much better burr, and suddenly its seeds are really getting around much faster and getting to areas where they can germinate and grow much better than the others. So the next cocklebur generation has a lot more of those prickly cocklebur genes in it than the genes belonging to not so prickly cockleburs. And so those sorts of structures can change much more rapidly in plant evolution than the structure of the flower itself. Hope that explanation worked. There are some things that have to change slowly because I have to do it in coordination with a lot of other members of the same species, and some things that can change on their own and gain a big advantage on their own.
We had a question about how can we learn more about how indigenous people influence plant here in Illinois?
That's a wonderful question. We have a big book in our library downstairs about indigenous uses of plants, and it's almost encyclopedic in its size. There are a few plants that indigenous people seem not to use in one way or another. And if you use a plant, then it becomes important to you and you know where it grows, and you may actually even facilitate its movement from one place to another so that it grows in convenient places for you. I was just listening to a podcast, it was last night or the night before, about Cahokia, the huge city along the Mississippi, in the Mississippi Valley in sort of southern Illinois along the Mississippi floodplain. And they have been able to figure out that people were moving into Cahokia from Mexico. They were moving into it from the far southeast of what's now the United States. They were moving it from the Midwest and the Lake States. So people were moving around a lot back then. It wasn't like everyone had a little existence and they stayed in one little local place. People were moving around, and with that movement, they would have moved the plants with them. So I think it's undoubtable that people were involved in those plants. I would, yeah, if you could make an appointment, you could come and look at that book in the library. It's a huge book and probably fairly expensive. But there is a lot known about Native people's use of plants, um, and it's out there in the literature if you look for it.
And a couple more people typing, but I'll ask another question of my own. Are there any trends for how seeds disperse? Like, do you tend to see the similar kind of dispersal in wetlands versus a prairie, or like trees versus herbaceous plants?
Um, I think, it's pretty obvious that burr-like plants generally have those burrs fairly close to the ground, which isn't surprising because they're trying to grab onto to mostly mammals. And so you would expect that burr-like plants at least became much more common with the evolution of mammals and perhaps mammal-like reptiles. Before that, I don't know where hair evolved. But so burrs are certainly more common in herbaceous plants than they are in taller plants. And even shrubs seem to have. I'm trying to think of. Not sure I can come up with a shrub that's burr-like and it's seed dispersal. So that's mostly herbaceous plants. I mean, I give you a few examples in wetlands of plants that use the water for dispersal. Trees, it seems, rely mostly on bird dispersal, particularly lots of things in the rose family and elm, the hackberries in the elm family. So um, they're mostly using bird dispersal or wind dispersal, uh, particularly before the evolution of flowering plants. Conifers were almost exclusively using wind dispersal. So there are some trends out there. I'm sure there are exceptions to almost all the generalizations I just made if you looked at all the tens of thousands of flowering plants on the earth today. But those sort of generalizations seem to hold pretty well.
And another question in the chat. So when talking about natives, do we apply a timeline of sorts, known to grow in a region for the last 50 years, 100 years, 500 years?
This is this is that's a really good question. Part of the answer is that I think part of the answer, I don't want to use the term pretentiously. Part of the answer is sort of philosophical. How do we think about where we are today versus the past before European Americans came? Or how do we think about that difference? Is it just one that's measured in years, or is there something fundamentally different about those two time periods uh, that makes we commonly refer to as a pre-European settlement landscape that's more different from today than just in years? The other answer, first of all, we don't know. With most native plants, we really don't know if they were here when Europeans got here and started writing things down. Um, we don't know if they were here for, they arrived, being somewhat facetious, if they arrived the day before or if they arrived 10,000 years before. Um, but but we do know they were here. So I don't think there is any real definition, but I'll put this question out there because it's been asked to me. Can something like, let's say, sweet clover, it's a weed, can that become a native plant? Or, and I say, can it become a native plant, not for some distant people in the thousands of years in the future, but for us and our community of people who call ourselves conservationists today and over the next century or so? Can it become a native plant by its residency here, or will there always be a fundamental difference between the time before us as a civilization, the difference between that time period as a special time period and the time after that. I would say there's a fundamental difference there we need to think about, but it's really open to interpretation.
Is the water plantain related to the common plantain that grows in yards? If so, which one do you think came first, and how may it have migrated?
The plantain of your yard is they're completely different plants. I think I don't know. I'm not an etymologist but plantain, that word, there's a prairie plantain and the plantain in your yard and a water plantain. They're all completely different plants in different plant families, but they all have fairly big, flappy sorts of leaves. And so I think that's why they all got that name, or the plantain name. It came from the shape of the leaf rather than because they all descend from they all flowering plants descend from a common ancestor, but not a recent common ancestor. They're in very different plant families and groups. But in that case, even though they're in different groups, they all evolve leaves that are at least superficially similar. It's another example of what I was talking about before. The flowers of those groups may be very different, but the leaves end up looking a lot alike because after all, they're all trying to gather sunlight.
Well, that's all the questions that I read in the
Okay.
chat. If anybody else
Well-
has any out there, feel free to put them in. I know I want to say for my part, we had a lot of fun hearing the answers from the wrong answers only poll. So I wanted to thank you all for participating in that and giving us silly answers to all the different things.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I like the interaction makes it more fun for me. Yeah, thank you for coming today. This was this the point I was. Jackie will give me just 30 more seconds. The point to me of studying seed dispersal, I mean, first of all, it's fascinating, obviously. And even we might not like dandelions, but if you look at a dandelion seed under a microscope, it is just amazingly beautiful. And so there's just the beauty of all these tiny structures in plants and how they work and how nature works, that just fascinating to me as a value all unto itself. But I think in understanding a changing world, we have to always think about dispersal, germination, establishment, competition. We have to think in that temporal, the time dimension, if we want to understand why the world is changing around us today. And we have to think in terms of population movement. And I think we do much too little of that. I know in thinking about oak reproduction and working on that for more than a decade now, it's how do seeds move around, why they move around, and how do they get to some places and not others. Anyway, thank you for coming today, and hope to see you next time.
Yes, thank you all. And remember to catch the recording on our @DiscoverMCCD YouTube channel under the Tom Talks playlist. There's all sorts of other presentations you can check out. Have a great day.